Who knows? Maybe that's what's going to happen. You'll have an elevated rail in New Orleans, the elevated streetcar,
Oh, the floating houses. Yeah, yep.
the floating houses,
the pontoon buses. We've got to have all of it. Yeah. And this sounds like a story that we should be writing, to be honest.
I know, right? It's the sitcom that we're going to be writing, the speculative future of New Orleans, where it's this.
Oh man, I wish I had a good title for it. I don't.
Laissez le bon tout brûler.
That's it. Yes. Yeah. Or laissez le pontoon brûler. There you go.
See, because I don't really know if anybody has, I driving in New Orleans for me was if I never drive on Clearview Avenue again, I will die a happy person. But it's also like, I don't think anybody really understands what it's like to be on the subway here in New York unless you experience it, because I was trying to tell my sister about it when she lived in Florida, and we were driving and we were at a stop sign. And I said, here's the deal about going on the MTA. I was like, do you see that water tower that's straight ahead of us? And she was like, yeah. I was like, okay, well, for us to get there via the MTA, we have to take a left and go 3 miles and then take another train that goes north past it. And then another one that comes. It's like, So yeah, maybe you guys can experience that too. From Pontchartrain down to from UNO down to the French Quarter, but you got to go via Kenner.
Well, as long as the streets are smooth, right?
Yes.
Well, Tim, I feel like we're procrastinating, talking about.
Wow.
It's a professional level segue.
Wow. That's really, really great. I was just wondering how we could start doing like really fancy transitions.
We did come together today to talk about procrastination in all of its forms and with all of its strengths and weaknesses. So when I put some real thought into it, what I noticed was that I had an epiphany about it. When you have procrastinated, which I'm making the fundamental assumption that you have in the past. Okay, there we go. When you have procrastinated, why do you think you were doing it? Either consciously or subconsciously, why do you think you were doing it?
Oh, I mean, we've talked about this before, how I put myself in a weird mental state. I graduated from UNO, from the University of New Orleans, in 96. And I had sort of forced upon myself this idea that now that I had a degree, I had to be good at it instantly. And it started as a small thought, and then it became worse and worse and worse until it became a part of my procrastination anyway. And then I never finished a story in 15 years. And so, yes, why did I do it? I think it was because I think it's a mixture. If I'm shooting from the hip right now, I'm thinking that it was because I was afraid of failure in writing something and finding out that a degree didn't mean anything, that it means certain things, obviously, but it also doesn't instantly make you good. You have to do the work. So I think I was afraid of finding out how much work I had to do. And also because I was tremendously lazy and didn't want to do the work of editing, which is always the thing. So in that first segment of my writing history, or maybe second, because I guess my first segment was sort of like school and finding out I really liked writing and wanted to be a writer. Post-college until about 2015, where I was like, I'd really like to be a writer, but I'm too afraid of it. I think that was a huge part of that segment of my procrastination. Was just, I didn't want to see how bad I was.
Wow. The thing that you brought up that I'm really glad that you brought up, and I thought you would, is fear. Because when I really started to think about why in the world would you not do something that ostensibly you want to do, it seems like the main reason to do that is that you're scared of something. And I mean, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me, right? And so that's when I'm like, what am I scared of? Because I've had challenges in developing good characters because I kind of grew up, by emulating people who really didn't value character over context or a number of things. I developed a style that made it harder for me to build character. The other thing was I was very dishonest with myself, and I wasn't allowing myself to be vulnerable, and that translated into characters, and so they became really flat pieces of paper. So when I kind of burst through that, because I have. I mean, I've gotten to the point where I feel like I can tell the truth. I can combine characters or combine real people or elements of real people into characters and have a fully realized person. And I feel like I've lived enough life that I can recognize. In the olden days, when you would actually go to a bank branch and you would stand in line at a bank branch and you'd see people fidgeting or how they make eye contact or how they kind of carry themselves, and you could project onto them, oh, I've seen this kind of behavior before. Remember, it reminds me of this other person. This is how they are. And so, okay, I'm going to characterize this individual that I haven't met in this way because it sort of maps to what I know about other people. So all of that, the trappings of that, right? Like I finally have a sense of, okay, I can actually model real people now.
Right.
Why am I not racing forward to do that? And it was fear. And so this was the epiphany. The times that I've been successful at doing this, where I've been able to publish a story, and I've got several of those, each time I was able to do it, the muse, right? The muse took me by the hand in the darkness of the cave, right? And put my hand on the rope line and said, follow this. And I would, focus on that exclusively for days on end in some cases, where I would sort of eschew the normal, trappings of life. I would eat, but like I wouldn't go to work. Right. I would just do that. And that's an unrealistic expectation, right? To have that activity occur every single time. You're waiting for some transparent force to sort of tell you how this should go. But it was this ability to kind of see the end or know that I was working towards something that could wrap itself up pretty quickly. Yeah. That's the fear that I have, is that I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how long it's going to take to get there. And when I was able to articulate that fear yesterday, walking the dog, I took your advice. I was walking the dog and I'm like, let me try this. I'm like, oh my God, Tim's a genius. But yeah, I had the epiphany while walking the dog. So I think I have a solution too. So if you're okay with it, I kind of want to throw a solution out there.
All right.
And look, this will work for me. One thing that I recognize is that no one thing works for everyone, and that's totally okay. And I think if you ever come across people who say, well, this is how you do it, that person's a charlatan, right? Or so self-absorbed that they can't imagine that other people don't think the way that they think. Yeah. So here's what's going to work for me. Anybody else who's out there who might be kind of puzzly in the brain, who's like math oriented, this might work for you as well. Folks who don't really line up with that, maybe skip ahead. but here's where the fear comes from. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get to the end. And so I came up with an idea that I'm going to try out this weekend. And I will report back on my progress next time we talk. It's really about figuring out how much work, how much labor translates into how many words that I create and can keep. Right? Because I'm a project manager in my day job, and I have direct reports, and I try to manage the workflow of others. And it was sort of a light bulb moment that I would say, well, gosh, I know how long it takes to create training, for example. I know how long it takes to do this, this, and this, but I've never applied that principle to my work. And I'm sure that kind of conversion rate of time to usable words is different for every writer. So I wouldn't presume to say, well, for me, it's, 10 to 1 or whatever it is. But that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take a 10-hour block, and it doesn't have to be consecutive, right? I'm just going to total up the number of words that I write in 10 hours. And then I'm going to go through an editing cycle, and I'm going to see how many of those words I keep. And those are two variables. How many words did I create? How many words did I end up keeping? And I'm going to divide them by 10 hours. And I'm going to get a words per hour rate. So that I can say, okay, if I'm trying to write a 2,500 word short story, what's my rate of how long I have to work to reach 2,500 kept words? And if that turns out to be, 55 hours, then I know that, okay, I hope it isn't. But if it turns out to be 55, I'm like, oh Lord, I'm really interested to do this activity because I have no idea what the numbers are going to show me. It might be depressing, but it's kind of cool. And that has helped me get over the fear, because now it's not like I'm writing with no end in sight, with no direction. I'm just in the cave wandering around with no rope line. Now, that's kind of like a little flashlight, and I'm going to give it a shot.
That sounds absolutely frightening to me. That's because, it's really funny that you say that, because I feel like I'm the exact opposite of that thinking, because I'm not the one that does the bookkeeping in my relationship. So maybe you're not talking to a numbers person here
Right.
specifically. I took English majors math at the University of New Orleans, which was like, this is a circle, and that was it. And so, setting up those goals, I think that that's a phenomenal idea for if that kind of works for you, because it helps to break down the amount of time you can put into something. Because it's sort of funny, because setting myself a goal of that many words kind of is like, oh, I don't know if I could do that, and that would be fearful for me. But knowing the amount of time that I would like to schedule myself, that is very, very appealing to me. I think one of the things that I've done as a procrastinator is I'm a sort of a piler. In other words, the mail will come for like 3 or 4 days, and I'm like, okay, you know what? I need to find a time that I can look through all this instead of doing it right away. Friends' texts come in on my phone, and I'm like, you know what? I need to wait until I have a time to do all that. And then I never schedule it. So, as from a scheduling standpoint, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm really excited to hear how it works out for you, because as a non-numbers person,
yeah, and I don't want to misrepresent what I'm thinking about, because I think you and I are probably more aligned than it would initially have seemed.
Oh, okay.
I'm not really interested in giving myself a word count or due dates or things like that. I really just want to organically capture how long, within a 10-hour time frame, because I just want the math to be easy. I want to divide by 10. That's all. I just want to divide by 10. But so I have a nice sample size of 10 hours worth of writing. We'll see how many words come out of that, however many it is. We'll do the division, and we'll see, how many that I've actually written. We'll see how many I've kept, as a completely open-ended exercise. And I think what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to say, okay, if it takes me, 5 hours of work to get one really good page of fiction, let's just say for fun, because that's easy math. Then if my story is 5 pages long, I'm going to have 25 hours of time. So then I can look forward and go, okay, well, I can plan, 4 hours a week, and I can do 6 here, and I can find time in my schedule and have an idea that, oh, I'll be done by this date, or I should be. And if I'm ahead of the curve, super. And if I'm behind, maybe I need a larger sample size.
Right.
But that helps me kind of break through that. Oh my God, I have so far to go. I don't even know where I am.
Right.
I'm just wandering in the desert. And I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, man. Maybe that won't help, but I kind of think it would.
I just think that that's a great idea that you've landed on that for a way to start. I mean, that's kind of one of the biggest things with me and procrastinating is just the starting. Am I kind of hitting around one of the ideas of this, so that you can say it's harder for you to start, but if you have this goal in mind or have these hours and you have that information, bam, you can hit the page.
Oh yeah, there's a quote Donald Barthelme in one of his stories called, I think it's called The Dolt, but it's one of those things that people will bring up over and over again because it's such a good quote. I think it's a quote from a character. The character says, and he's talking about writing, but he says, endings are elusive, middles are nowhere to be found, but like worst of all is to begin. And I'm like, yes, that, it's just hard to start because, and I think we've talked about this before, the blank page is very intimidating to me. And I had an example recently, like within the last 5 days or so, I was working on the Tandy 1000 TL. I even snapped a picture of it, sent it to you, remember? I'm like, it's happening. Yeah. And it was fun, right? But I got to a point where the flash, the little spark of inspiration had kind of burned out. Mm-hmm. And I was just listening to the hum of the computer and staring at the screen. And I'm like, I don't know where to go. And I think I've read, our brains are wired to help us avoid pain. Yeah. And so when you start to feel pain in that process, your brain's like, well, let's go over here. Let's something shiny. Like, let's get peanut butter, whatever. And it worked. My brain convinced me to quit because it was hard. So that's what I'm trying to punch through. And if I know that, like, well, look, I can I can do this. It's only going to take another 30 hours. I have the time budgeted. Like, just do another half hour. Just do another half hour, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get at, is a way to kind of beat back the fear
of looking at that blank page.
Yeah. You know, there was one other guy, and then I'll be quiet, I promise. But there was, at Texas State, we had a guest speaker come in, and he was again, I'm purposely not going to use names because I don't think it's useful, but he was really inspiring. He came in to talk, and I think he had published some stuff in the Paris Review, and he had several collections of short stories out, and they were really good. But he had this great analogy. He's like, writing can be as smooth and as simple and easy as, a glass lake of water, and you're just in a canoe, just kind of stroking, and you're just like gliding along in this beautiful, pristine lake. But sometimes you get to the shore and you have to pick up the canoe and walk it to the next lake.
Right.
Before you can start having that smooth experience again. I'm like, oh my God, that's a perfect analogy. So I wanted to share that with you. And I've always had trouble picking up the canoe and walking it over to the next lake.
Oh yeah. My lakes are very, very small. And the woods between them are so fucking unnavigable. Part of that fear for me in my post-college career of writing was, you talked earlier about emulating, other writers. And I think that I put that into myself as well. Like the writers that I really fell in love with in college. And we've talked about this before, like Vonnegut and Kafka could pack so much into so little. And I think that's why I'm drawn towards shorter stories. And it didn't click in my head that emulating them at 22, please don't tell me how old Kafka was or how old Vonnegut was when we started.
I don't know.
Emulating them without doing all of the work was a real, I didn't make that connection. I think I just had so much ego coming out of college. I was just like, hey, wait a minute. How come this isn't working out? How come this isn't easy? I was supposed to glide across this lake, and I can't even get the canoe in the first lake, you know? That's a really great analogy. And I think it's writing is so much fun for me at times. And then when the muse goes away, you're like, all right, well, now it's the work. And that's the stuff that I'm trying to switch. Instead of chasing for a muse, I'm trying to be more interested in the writing. And again, not to talk about it too much, but I seem like I bring it up all the time. The classes and the books that I've kind of ingested on narrative improv really helped me as a storyteller, because it was just begin. One of the big things is when you're on stage doing an improv show, regardless of if it's gag improv or narrative improv, the lights go down and you have to begin, and really great improv. And I think of folks like Iron Cobra in Canada, or Dad's Garage. They make it look so easy that there are a lot of times where people sort of ask, how did you rehearse that? You had to have rehearsed that. You couldn't have come up with that off the top of your head. And they don't. It's just because it's just starting. And so when I finally kind of came to that conclusion, it's sort of like you can have the inspiration hit where there's a sentence or a word that really sort of triggers it. It's just go. And that was the hardest thing for me to do, was to start. And so that's kind of where all the work is. And that's what I really enjoy doing now, is trying to do that wherever I can get it, wherever that sort of sentence or that beginning or that idea happens. I try to capture it in the moment. That's, of course, not very difficult. We all have jobs. Some of you have children who you have to feed or whatever. But because that was also one of the big things, is in procrastination for me, if I was hit by that sort of inspiration, or I was excited to, oh, you know what, I've scheduled this time to write, I know what I'm going to write about, I'm excited about it, part of that procrastination was the vibe, the situation, my physical location, the music, everything had to be just right, which was another form of procrastination. Well, I can't write today because, geez, that jackhammer outside is really throwing me off. Or, oh man, I don't have any sugar. I forgot sugar for my coffee. Or, this isn't the Pearl Jam record I wanted to listen to while I write. For me, I had to get the canoe in the lake, and I had to act as if I was being chased by some sort of 5-legged, saber-toothed, long, clawed animal to get in the water to like start.
Wow.
That was actually very horrible. Actually,
Yeah, that's grim.
Yeah, that was really bad.
It's interesting though. I kind of want to explore that. This is a therapy time with Tim.
Right.
No, but for real, do you? So when you decide to write, do you kind of sit down and know what you're going to work on, or do you just block out time and say, "Well, this is the time I have to write. Let me see what I'm interested in working on when I sit down." Which one is it?
Well, I have zero chill sometimes when it comes to writing. I think that's how the kids say it, or maybe it's even too old for the kids now. But like when I sit down, I know that there are certain like lit mags that I really, really love and would love to be a part of. There's writing. There are writers that I'd really like to sort of to emulate, that I'd love to find my voice within that style that they write in. This also within the improv community, there's this sort of like, is it short form? Is it long form? And that means, are you doing a show that has like 2 to 5 minute, scenes, or are you doing a long form thing like a herald? And for those that don't know what that means, essentially, heralds are all of Seinfeld, which is you have a lot of disparate things happening in the first act, and they all magically come together at the end. That's sort of an idea of long form, or a long form improv movie, blah, blah, blah. And I was always sort of against that. I felt like improv shows should be whatever length the scene is to tell a good story. That's how long it should be. I did a scene once with a gentleman named Munson Hicks on stage at Jiva Theater Center a long time ago. The scene was 30 seconds long, and it's the best thing that I ever did, mainly because all I did was listen and say yes and instead of what I usually did, which was like steamroll through with my own ideas. But like for story length, it's sort of like, oh, you know what? I really would love to write something a little bit small. And so I just sort of randomly, usually in the morning, usually between the first and second cup of coffee, I'll hit the page running with something that just kind of comes naturally to me and start working through it. And then if I can sort of like find an end within that, cool. Usually if I'm trying to write something science fiction, I'm like, I want to write something a little bit longer because I love the world building of that. I love making up names. I love using gobbledygook, old school Star Trek original series science of like the plasmatronic alpha black is not doing the thing and we need to reverse the polarity.
Oh my God, not the alpha black.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love it. I just had, I've been very, very fortunate. There's a group of folks who picked up the longest short story that I've submitted anywhere. And I definitely have the GN, I named something in it the GNDN cabling. Do you know what that is?
No.
In Star Trek, if you watch the original series, if they open up a panel in the Enterprise, there might be a tube that says GNDN, and that was the crew's inside joke. It stands for Goes Nowhere, Does Nothing.
That's awesome.
So to answer your question, when I hit the page, I have a vague sense that I would love to write something short, and then sometimes I'm like, I want to work on something a little bit longer, and then I'll just sort of hit the ground running with that and see what I can do. I think one of the biggest problems, and we've talked about this over the past 30 years, Art, is that I tend to, early on in my career, and I'm still trying to get over it, I tend to put a gimmick before the story or the characters. That was another part of my fear, was not writing the vulnerability that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. I would have these setups. So when you were talking about seeing the light at the end of the cave and having an idea of how you wanted to go, I unfortunately did that that was another way that I procrastinated, was I'll never get to that spot. Or I would work it so hard that it was like really forced to get to that ending.
Yeah. And
so I think one of the great things that I'm trying to learn in my own writing is to not have an expectation of where it's going to end. Mm. I have one more example that I can share with you. I've been working on a piece that had been rejected 25 times. And I was working on it one night, and it's a very personal piece. When I was a lot younger, and a bigger asshole than I am now, I was sort of like, I can't wait to make $1 million off of all the stories about these crazy ex-girlfriends. And then I suddenly woke up a couple of years ago and realized that they weren't the problem in those relationships. It was me. So I had this piece that I was working on that I've really been like working on. And I had this ending, and I really was like, this is where it's got to go. And then I found a submission deadline. And then I was like, all right, you know what? Let me do this. I cut out the last 200 words and replaced it with 7, and it got accepted.
Nice.
So, and it's a totally different ending than what I had. You know, and those kind of moments are weird to find because with all of the procrastination that I've done in like, well, how am I going to do this? And I just don't want to face the prospect of trying to end this story. That fear came from my trying to maybe emulate what others did or what I saw instead of kind of maybe trying to find the natural terminus for it.
It's actually interesting that you mention the gimmick, right? Because I know we've talked about that a lot.
Yeah.
I have an idea. If you want to try your own kind of writing exercise, you know, for the next time we get together, where I'm doing this whole, you know, math problem, you know, trying to mathify it, you know, you could try leaning into the gimmick as a way to find the truth. The gimmick is obviously a hook for how you get excited about kind of sitting down and going into something. And it seems like when you discard the gimmick, you know, in favor of whatever's happening below that or within it, that there's some good meat on the bone there. And that might just be the way that you trick your brain into getting into something that's, you know, substantial and relevant and timely, is that you use this gimmick of, you know, what if a spaceship flew backwards, right? And then you're like, you know, and so, but then that sort of morphs into, well, what if a person could go back in time and fix, you know, a mistake that they made, and how would that change their life going forward or whatever? So I think that's I mean, look, if you don't want to do it, that's okay. But I think that might be a really interesting opportunity, and just see what comes of it.
That might be. Lean into the gimmick. Oh gosh, what will you unleash?
I don't know. Well, yeah, that's true. But just as a way of, it's almost like the key that unlocks the door. So you know, once you've unlocked the door and you've walked into the apartment, you don't need the key anymore. So you just put it on the shelf, right? Until you leave, and then try to come back. Yeah.
What you just said about walking into an apartment, it's like any of the tasks that I have. The amount of time that I think about the task is so much more than just doing the task. So for me with procrastination, there's so much more, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this, than the actual doing of it. And I'm trying to tip the scales in favor of the doing as opposed to being nervous about it. And I think for me, it was finally just sort of like stealing a little bit of that improv teaching and just bam, start. Don't think about it. You have an idea. You're going to talk about this person or that event. Just go. And that can be, and it's so easy to say that. That's what's really rough about sometimes when you get writing advice from other people and you read books or you see, you know, like, I don't know, master classes. I don't know who's done I've tried to watch the Joyce Carol Oates one, but anyway, for all of that advice that you get, you know, I mean, this is something that I've heard a lot, is just do it. You just have to do the work. Just do the work. I think you might have mentioned, didn't Hemingway have something like that? You were saying that he was like, you just got to do the work.
Yeah, he had a lot of different ways of saying the same thing, which is basically, why aren't you writing?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
And so I think for me as a really great procrastinator, you know, and sort of owning that. But when I was younger, I'd be like, oh, I'm a procrastinator. What are you going to do? You know what I hear? I hear U2 is a pretty big bunch of procrastinators as well when they got to get their records done. And look at how successful they were. And it's like, yeah, so where's one story from you? It's like, oh, wait. So earlier on as a procrastinator, I sort of wore it as a badge of like pride to cover up the fact that I wasn't doing work. But now it's something that I actively try to squelch whenever I can.
Yeah. Well, so the other side of the coin, right, from procrastination is actually accomplishing things, right? We wouldn't be here with publications under our belt if we were only procrastinators. And I think the thing that moves the needle for me is a deadline. And it's funny that you just mentioned deadlines. So I see those as two sides of the same coin. And I know I've told a story on this podcast before about a time that I basically started a, graduate level paper at 1 a.m, the day it was due, and gave myself essentially, 14, 15 hours to get it done and was able to get it done. Would I choose to do that every time? God, I hope not. That was very
Yeah.
stressful and
Yeah.
stupid, right? Like there was no real benefit, no tangible benefit. But the deadline is what made me do it. So here's my next question for you, Tim.
Okay.
What deadlines actually get you motivated? The ones that you set yourself or the ones that are externally set? Or both?
There is a lit mag that I'm a huge fan of, and I absolutely love it. And they do submission calls randomly, and they do submission calls for different things. So sometimes it's, we're going to do a poetry thing. We're going to do maybe 1,000-word thing, or maybe a 200-word thing. And having something, maybe 1, 2, or 3 things for that publication when those things open up is what drives me. So I think if I had a deadline for, let's say, hey, we want a 5,000-word science fiction piece and we want it at the end of February, and we're in January, I'd probably start, but then I'd probably be writing it in the last week. So the deadlines do help, but the one that really motivates me for writing a lot more are those magazines that I really like, whose deadlines are unpredictable, but they're there. So that's been a really motivating factor for me, and a lot of the stuff that I've done is like, I want to have a piece that's ready. Unfortunately, as I've already said before, this is the one magazine that really sort of is the most Tim has no chill one. I mean, I've submitted, and I get so like, the only thing that I can equate it to is when I was a little kid, I wanted so much from the band Living Colour that I was always scouring through the import section of record stores and all of the record stores, and I would just always go looking for that one piece that I didn't have. And when they would have something that I didn't have from the band Living Colour, I would turn into this, like, I'd have to hold on to it. I gotta go. Do I have my money? It made me nuts to where I just had to pick it up. I had to grasp onto it. I had to take it right to the register. I had to buy it because I needed it. And that's kind of what happens with this one lit mag, to the point where I've like submitted things with a misspelling in the title.
Oh, wow.
I've submitted things that I'm like, oh my gosh, they're open. Okay, 750 words, done. Okay, fill this out, fill this form out, submit, unsubmittable, done. And then I realize, oh, they were looking for holiday themed things? Shit. So having a nebulous deadline that it could happen at any moment really drives me to have pieces that are prepared and done. But having like a deadline, I definitely know that I would probably be like, well, I'll sketch out some ideas, and then it'd be like 2 hours before the deadline is, and I'd be like, okay. And then, so then they accuse this person, they say no, the gun goes off, and the spaceship explodes, the end, goodbye, there we go.
This is so cool. I hadn't really put thought into how we're similar, but also where we diverge. And I think this is one of those places where we diverge. I mean, I'm finding a lot of interest in diving into this math problem and using that as a way to kind of solve my fear of doing the work. And you're like, yeah, I don't want any part of that. And then you're like, well, nebulous deadlines are good as long as I'm like working on something. And I'm thinking, yeah, that won't work for me. Not even a little. I need to have a hard, minute line in the sand, date, time, location, and if it's not in, that's your ass. And that's what motivates me for whatever reason. And it always has. But I'm really good at hitting deadlines. Like once you give me, you know what it is? This is probably what it is. Here we go. Second epiphany of the day. It probably is a way that my brain finally sort of sloughs off the hair shirt of being perfect. If you have a deadline and you've got to hit it, you don't have the luxury of being perfect. And so you can give yourself the excuse that you don't have enough time. So don't do that. Well, wait, nope, you do not have enough time. Stop doing that. And you just get to the end. Well, hey, look at that. I can learn something.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that was a big thing for me too, as far as the procrastinating, this idea of perfection. And I'm really glad that I got out of that. If my Lord and Savior Bono of U2 only a few years ago said, yeah, there's some songs that I'd really love to go back and change, and he's talking like about stuff off the Joshua Tree, forget it. You're not going to be perfect. It's going to be what it is, relax,
Yeah.
send it in.
I've heard that a lot in the board game industry, where designers say a game's never finished, it's just published. And I imagine that applies to pretty much any creative endeavor. I know I've gone back and looked at stories that I've published and said, oh man, I really wish I could go in and tinker. But what's the point, right? Like that work is an expression of who you were, what your point of view was at that time. That time has passed, and you really should look at it almost like an archaeological artifact more than something that reflects who you are now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what have we learned about procrastination?
We're good at it.
Are we afraid of coming to the end?
Are we stalling? I like deadlines. Wait, that can't be it.
Wait. All right. How about this then? We'll do it for both of us. We have 2 minutes to wrap this up.
Oh no.
Maybe we got to go back to the beginning and figure out what we did.
For me, the importance of deadlines and having them be external is useful, but I don't have any external deadlines that are beating down the door for me to get stuff done. So I've got to learn. My takeaway is what I need to work on. And I need to work on setting deadlines that I'm going to hold myself to, because my deadlines are garbage. When I say, okay, I'm going to have this done by the 5th, and like the 5th comes and goes and there's nothing. And I go, you know what? I was busy. I will have this done by the 10th. And like the 10th comes and goes. So I have to have the strength of will to hold myself to these deadlines. And I can do it in every other discipline. At work, of course, I'm really good at hitting deadlines at work, but there's a financial benefit to it. If I don't hit the deadlines, my finances are in trouble. So there's clear and present urgency to do that. But even when I was doing board game design, which I still do, but when I was really heavily into it, I would sort of communicate out to the customers that we had, hey, a new expansion is coming out. And I would basically just pick a date on the calendar and go, late November. And then as late November was coming, I'm like, why did I tell people that? Like invariably, it was always this mad rush to get everything done. So I can hit deadlines. And even if I self-imposed those deadlines, the act of communicating it out to people who were interested in buying it was enough to make it an external deadline. But like you and I have talked, and I'm like, okay, yeah, let's have work we can share on the 12th. And man, that just comes and goes. So like, what is it about these deadlines that's what I need to work on is really figuring. And I think that's where this math problem that I'm coming up with will help, because I can set a deadline that is reasonable. I think the reason I can't stick to the deadlines is they're unreasonable. I'm like, well, in a perfect world, I won't have life to live, children to manage. Yeah, and I'll just get it done by the 12th. So.
Yeah, and I think that for myself with procrastination, I think I'd like to take a walk towards you and set up some more for myself. You know, last year I tried to get something. I was like, you know what? Maybe I should try and have one thing published every month. That would be very helpful for my mindset to make me feel like I was on the right path. But then I sort of started to be like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is it really helping me? Like, what am I doing? So yeah, I'd like to evaluate that more, take a step towards you and maybe set up some goals that help me sort of work towards something. I'm just not sure what yet.
Yeah. Well, I've always said this, like between you and me, if we could put both of us together, we'd make one good writer.
And that's definitely 70-30 Art, but I don't know.
I agree. You're the 70.
You're the 70. And